Today is Saturday, September 21st. With Election Day just about a month and a half away now, both presidential candidates are focusing on turning out the vote. But what kinds of voter registration trends are we seeing during this unprecedented election cycle? What people and events caused spikes in voter registrations? And what does that really mean for Election Day? TargetSmart Senior Advisor Tom Bonier joins me to break down what he's seeing in this year's registration data, from what surprised him the most to the impact of Taylor Swift's endorsement to what he's watching for next. Welcome to the Newsworthy Special Edition Saturday, when we sit down with a different expert or celebrity every Saturday to talk about something in the news. Don't forget to tune in every Monday through Friday for our regular episodes, where we provide all the day's news in 10 minutes. I'm Erica Mandy. It's now time for today's Special Edition Saturday. Tom Bonier, thank you for joining us here on the Newsworthy.
It's great to be here.
So first, I'd love to hear what kinds of voter registration trends overall that you've seen so far this election season, especially compared to the last two presidential elections.
Yeah, it's been an interesting year, to put it mildly. You sort of have a tale of two election cycles within one election cycle, where prior to President Biden withdrawing from the race and endorsing Vice President Harris, you saw registration data that frankly didn't look very good for Democrats, looked better for Republicans. You saw a higher level of engagement from Republicans. And then really, as if a switch was flipped after July 21st, when that candidate change happened, you saw many more registrations from voters who traditionally would be thought of as Democratic voters. So younger voters, women, voters of color. And when we look at the new voter registrations in that time period, after Vice President Harris became the nominee, what we see is, in some cases, triple the amount of new registrants that we were seeing from those exact same groups, younger voters, women, and voters of color, compared to the last couple of presidential cycles at the same period of time.
Did you expect that when you heard about the change in nominee, or did it surprise you?
Yeah, I was surprised. Perhaps I shouldn't have been, but we think back to the 2022 elections. It was really the last time that we saw registration increases that were really out of the ordinary. Generally, you don't see big fluctuations one way or another in new voter registration. Sure, sometimes they'll slightly benefit Democrats or slightly benefit Republicans, but it was in 2022 after the Dobbs decision when we saw this bigger increase in registrations among women. I didn't expect that either, I have to admit. I certainly didn't expect to see even bigger numbers 2 years later.
And the Dobbs decision, of course, when Roe v. Wade was overturned. What about after the Harris-Trump debate? What did you see in the numbers then?
So what we saw, if you're thinking about this sort of charted out, I'm a visual person, is we saw in that first week after July 21st, the first week of the Harris campaign, this big spike. And then things sort of returned, maybe not down to where they were before, but it wasn't the same sort of spike or peak. It just kind of was chugging along in terms of new voter registrations that likely slightly benefited Democrats, but not overwhelmingly so. And then what we saw was this moment in the debate. If you look at these new voter registration requests just over, and our team did this, we looked at this compressed period of time where you saw a massive increase as the debate went on, more and more people going online and hitting these online voter registration services saying, I want to register to vote, or I want to make sure that I'm registered to vote. Some people are already registered. They want to confirm that they were registered in the right place.
Of course, one of the things that happened after the debate was Taylor Swift posted to Instagram, and she specifically put a link in her Instagram bio for people to register to vote. Did that have an impact?
It sure did. Again, in this somewhat strange election cycle where we're seeing a lot of things that don't have a great precedent. In this case, when you looked at those increases that I just mentioned during the debate, generally you would look at those and say, okay, well, that's something unusual to see that big of an increase. But when you look at the same chart of these registration requests, you can see this real big spike immediately following Taylor Swift's Instagram post. We're talking about a 400 to 500% increase in registration attempts after Taylor Swift made that post. So again, when you see an increase of 20 or 30% as a data analyst, that catches your eye. That's something that's unusual. To see 400, 500%, that sort of thing just generally doesn't happen.
Have you ever seen one individual have that much impact?
I've not. I mean, the closest that I could come to that would be looking at the data from 2018 when Taylor Swift made an endorsement in the United States Senate race in Tennessee. And we looked at the registration data there and we saw a spike there. But even that wasn't anywhere close to what we saw in this sort of post-debate Instagram post urging people to register to vote and actually providing them with a link to do it.
The question of will it actually impact the election is kind of unknown, I imagine.
Yeah, that's the key question everyone's asking. No one can answer that definitively. What I can share is if we look at data from prior election cycles, understanding that we don't have a great precedent for this, but we can look at people who registered to vote relatively close to the election and prior elections, going back to 2020, the last presidential election especially. And what we find is that those new registrants tend to vote at a much higher rate than the overall population. If we look at people who registered from July onward in 2020, 83% of them voted in the election, regardless of partisanship. Democrats, Republicans, that's the overall turnout.
So people registering July and later often are actually voting.
Absolutely. So, at this point, I do expect to see these new registrants overwhelmingly come out to vote. Again, we'll see. We'll have to wait until Election Day to see. But if they follow the past precedent, I would expect to see them voting at very high rates.
Any other celebrity endorsement or event that you saw that had some sort of surge of voter registration from either party?
The thing that's become the biggest day of registration over the entire course of the election cycle is National Voter Registration Day. That's a day where you get lots of attention from not just one celebrity, but many celebrities and many non-celebrities and people talking to their friends and Democrats, Republicans, independents really sharing links. I certainly saw that in my social media feeds with a lot of people sharing information about the importance of registering to vote. When we look at that data, again, I looked at the 2020 election cycle. There was no single day during the 2020 election that had more people registering to vote. I would expect we'll see something very similar, if not even bigger numbers this time around.
Still ahead, what the data says about battleground states, the issues on voters' minds the most, and one thing our guest is watching closely heading into Election Day. But first, a quick break for our sponsors. This episode was brought to you by Honeylove. As a busy professional and parent, I need to feel and look both stylish and comfortable. I want to run around with my son without worry and also still feel like my put-together adult self. Honeylove has revolutionized everything from leggings and tanks to shapewear and bras to offer everything I need in my everyday essentials and beyond. For example, I choose to wear Honeylove's Legging 2.0 for so much of what I do. Work from home, run errands, work out, go to the park, you name it. And it's not just leggings. All of their items, from shapewear to bras, are designed to be comfortable, functional, and make you look and feel great. Honeylove is not just supporting women, it's empowering women. Treat yourself to the best bras, shapewear, leggings, and tanks on the market and save 20% off at honeylove.com/newsworthy. Use our exclusive link to get 20% off, honeylove.com/newsworthy, to find your perfect fit. After your purchase, they ask you where you heard about them, so please support our show and tell them we sent you. Elevate your comfort, elevate your style with bras that empower your lifestyle of flexibility. The Newsworthy is also brought to you by ZocDoc. I've had good experiences and not so good experiences in doctor's offices. I've even switched doctors mid-pregnancy because I wasn't getting the care I felt I deserved. But of course, no matter how good a doctor is, I also need doctors who take my insurance, can get me in for an appointment in a reasonable amount of time, and are accessible based on where I live. And that's a lot to figure out. That's why I use a tool to make that search easier. ZocDoc is a free app and website where you can search and compare high-quality, in-network doctors, choose the right one for your needs, and click to instantly book an appointment. We're talking about in-network appointments with more than 100,000 healthcare providers across every specialty, from mental health to dental health, eye care to skin care, and much more. You can filter for doctors who take your insurance, who are located nearby, who are a good fit for any medical need you may have, and who are highly rated by verified patients. Plus, ZocDoc appointments happen fast, typically within just 24 to 72 hours of booking. You can even score same-day appointments. So stop putting off those doctor's appointments and go to ZocDoc.com/newsworthy to find and instantly book a top-rated doctor today. That's ZocDoc.com/newsworthy. ZocDoc.com/newsworthy. Okay, now back to my conversation with TargetSmart's Tom Bonier. What are you seeing in the data specifically in those crucial battleground states so far?
What's interesting to me when we look at this voter registration data is almost how consistent it is across the country, whether you're talking about a battleground state or a so-called red state, a state that would generally be expected to vote Republican, or a blue state, a state that would be reliably Democratic. It speaks to how, I think, organic what we're seeing is, that people are just doing this because of their own excitement or enthusiasm or interest in this race. One of the states where I actually saw some of the biggest increases in voter registration in that period after July 21st was Louisiana. And that's not a state that I think anyone would expect to be competitive in this election, but what you're seeing is this interest. So yes, you're seeing big increases that are likely to have an impact on the outcome of what should be a close election in places like North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and I could name all the battleground states. It's across all of them, but you're also seeing big increases in other states that not only might not be competitive at the presidential level, but don't have other statewide elections that are perceived to be competitive.
So based on some of that data that you're seeing so far, do you expect overall voter turnout to be high in this election?
I do. You know, if you had asked me that question earlier in July, I would have said no, because all of the data was actually pointing in the opposite direction. You know, in 2020, we had this great triumph of democracy in the end, because during a pandemic where there were so many challenges to holding an election, a credit to our election officials around the country, they were not only able to successfully hold an election in the midst of the pandemic, they were able to set a record in turnout, the highest turnout as a share of the eligible population that we've seen in about a century. And so I think a lot of people looked at that precedent and they said, well, the data is telling us that most Americans aren't super excited about a rematch of the same two candidates again. And so we seem to be headed towards a lower turnout election. And now what we've seen is everything has turned, not just with this voter registration data, but actually voters tend to feel more positively, not just about Vice President Harris, but interestingly, Donald Trump's favorabilities have also gone up and have grown more positive. So all of that is suggesting, I don't know at this point that I would predict that turnout will exceed what we saw in 2020, but it's certainly in the conversation now, which is not something anyone would have said a couple of months ago.
How exactly do you track and gather all of this information?
So we have a great team. They go out and they collect this data from every state, in some cases from local election officials. And again, a credit to the election officials who are managing this type of information. And so our team goes out and collects those lists. They compile them all together. They clean them up. They'll add additional data to these lists so that we have even more information about who these people are, and even some models about the sorts of issues that might be their most important issues when they're thinking about an election. And our team is doing that on a constant basis throughout the year so that we always have the most current information.
Has anything stood out either about the issues or just anything else that we haven't talked about yet that you want to mention?
Just to what extent the Dobbs decision, as you noted, the decision that overturned the Roe v. Wade abortion rights decision from almost 50 years earlier, how that decision has really reshaped and reshuffled how Americans in general are thinking about elections. And you've seen a lot more crossover in these elections since that Dobbs decision that happened June 24th of 2022. It's impacted every election that has taken place since. We've seen abortion rights move up in terms of what we call saliency, what people think of as the most important or impactful issue. And so I'd point to that. It's certainly not the only issue, obviously. We know that voters are very concerned about issues like inflation, the economy, immigration. You're still seeing those rise to the top as well. But seeing abortion rights and the way it's impacted voter turnout and voter persuasion since 2022 and in many ways is actually more salient at this moment, is pretty remarkable.
I know we talked a little bit about this, but is there any one thing you're really watching closely in the next couple of months as we head into Election Day?
What I really geek out on is early vote data. We know that people are actually starting to vote in some key states already. And with every week, there will be more people voting. 100 million Americans cast a ballot before Election Day in 2020. The numbers likely won't be quite as high this time around because of the lack of a pandemic, thankfully. But a lot of people are going to vote before Election Day. Just like we get new voter registration data, we get daily updates on who actually cast a ballot. Still a secret ballot. We don't know for whom you voted, but we can see if people voted. That's going to give us a great indicator of how things are looking, what turnout is like, and is the early vote data appearing to favor one candidate or another? Are there more Democrats voting, more Republicans voting, and looking at these demographic groups that we talked about? So I'll be spending a lot of time looking at that information.
Well, since we've been talking all about voter registration in this episode, we want to take a moment before we go to remind you to register to vote and make your voice heard. I caught up with the executive director of When We All Vote, Beth Link, about the time it actually takes, and it's probably shorter than you think, and a key point to remember.
It's a short form. It takes a minute or two to check your voter registration. And if it says you're not registered to vote, and I will say for people who are listening, it's not just people who've never been registered to vote. If you got married, if you moved, you have to re-register. So check your voter registration. You'll put in your address. You'll put in your current name. It literally takes a minute. If it says, hey, you're not registered, registering to vote takes just 7 minutes.
Yeah, just 1 to 7 minutes max. So check your voter registration status now at weall.vote. We put the link in today's episode notes as well. All right, thank you so much for listening today. If you found this episode interesting or valuable, please be sure to share it with a friend. And of course, tune into The Newsworthy again on Monday for our next 10-minute daily news roundup, keeping you in the know as you start the work week. Until then, have a great weekend.